Don, we get paid to talk.
We do, don't we?
So much
Good
fun.
point, Jen. It is. It is. I like this. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a senior consultation specialist with Atkins Realis. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream topics on the Northern Road Link project as it moves through the provincial environmental assessment and federal impact assessment processes. The topics we are covering parallel our project activities, so we hope these will help our viewers and listeners better understand the project and provide input along the way. With me today is my usual co host, Jennifer Ashwazage Pereira, my colleague and an Indigenous engagement and traditional knowledge specialist at Atkins Realis. Jennifer is a member of Henvey Inlet First Nation, located on the French River south of Sudbury, and works with me on our projects across Canada. Welcome, Jen. Have you been on the live stream lately? I don't believe you have.
I was here last week, and
Oh, yeah,
prior to
you did it
that, it
last
had
week.
been a month. We were saying I was MIA.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, I remember from the radio show last week, but I couldn't remember from the live stream. But anyway, good to have you back here, and we have a interesting topic today:
We do.
climate adaptation and resilience study plans. This is one of the areas that we're going to be studying as part of the environmental, that we are studying as part of the environmental and impact assessments. So without further ado, why don't we get started here, Jen, and do a little
Okay.
run through of what we're going to chit chat about.
Hmm.
We're going to do our usual project background. We're going to talk about future climate characterization, climate impact assessment, risk treatment and adaptation measures, cumulative effects assessment, and then follow up or round things off, I should say, with follow up and monitoring programs and commitments. So um, lots to talk about. Great topic, important topic, very relevant topic given climate change and its impacts that we are seeing each and every day now. And so, why don't we get started with a little bit of background on the project? Um, the Northern Road Link is a proposed all-season road in Northern Ontario that would sit on Treaty 9 land. It would connect the Ring of Fire mineral deposits to the provincial highway network through a connection with the Martin Falls Community Access Road, also known as MFCAR, and it would also provide, with the construction of the Webequie Supply Road, an opportunity for Webequie First Nation to connect to the provincial highway network as well. This project, as you probably gathered, is subject to the Environmental Assessment Act and the Impact Assessment Act. Um, the two project proponents for the Northern Road Link project are two remote First Nations, both about 500 kilometers um, north of Thunder Bay in slightly different directions. And those two communities are Martin Falls First Nation and Webequie First Nation. So, as I mentioned, these communities are remote, so they access by road is occurs only in the winter for a very limited time, typically 4 to 6 weeks, and that time is shrinking each and every year, it seems, due to climate
Hmm.
change. And there have been numerous historical studies looking at transportation corridors to the Ring of Fire. Uh, and then in 2020, the province of Ontario, Martin Falls First Nation, and Webequie First Nation agreed to work together um, and conduct a provincial environmental assessment for the project. And that provincial environmental assessment, once the federal government looked at the project, they then required a federal impact assessment to be undertaken for the project. In terms of the interaction of this project with the other two all-season road projects that are also undergoing environmental assessments or impact assessments, the Northern Road Link project sits in the middle of the three. So from the northern end, we have the planned Webequie Supply Road, which is a road that extends from Webequie Airport southeast to east of the Muckatai River in the McFalls Lake area, where it is planned to meet with the Northern Road Link north end, and then that would extend south to link with the Martin Falls Community Access Road west of Martin Falls, and then that road, the Martin Falls Community Access Road, extends south to connect with a couple of resource roads that would be upgraded, and then ultimately they would connect with the provincial highway network. So that's how everything sort of all fits together. Um, and the idea for the road is to enable economic activity by uh, uh, helping the transport of goods, efficient transport of goods, services, and resources. So, in terms of project components, it's more than just a two-lane road. Um, so this would be a multi-use road all season, of course. Right now, we don't have a definite length for the road. It would range anywhere between 117 and 164 kilometers in length, and the reason for that is we have alternatives for different road segments. And so we're in the process now of finalizing, finishing the analysis and evaluation of comparison between the alternatives. And once those are identified, a final route will, or corridor, preferred corridor will be identified. And when we talk about a corridor, we're talking about a 2 kilometer wide swath of
Hmm.
land and water. And the idea of that is to serve as a planning corridor. Um, and so the actual road would sit somewhere in that 2 kilometer wide corridor. But the 2 kilometers in width gives us room to make any route adjustments in the event that we encounter things that might pose a bit of a problem, cause some unwanted impacts. So that's why we have a like a kilometer, we have a corridor as opposed to an actual route at this point.
So we have
There's
lots of wiggle
one,
room.
we have lots of wiggle room. That's a good way to describe it. There would be numerous water crossings, as you can imagine, given the area. But the biggest crossing is that of the Attawapiskat River, which is over 200 meters. There is a lot of other infrastructure. We use the word ancillary. That just basically means additional infrastructure or accessory infrastructure. Um, some of which would be temporary, some of which would be permanent. This includes storage and laydown areas, which would be temporary during construction phase. Maintenance and facilities and yards would be permanent because they would be used for the operations and maintenance of the road. Access roads, some would be permanent, some would be temporary, depending on the facilities that they lead to and whether those are permanent or temporary. Aggregate sites, some are temporary, some are permanent. Aggregate sites are, of course, where the construction material comes from and the material to maintain the road. So the gravel and the smaller rock that's used to protect culverts, for example. And then construction camps are another component, infrastructure component that would be part of this project. These camps would be located at various intervals along the road, and the idea is the workers would stay there while they're working in the vicinity. And typically, those construction camps are associated with storage and laydown yards as well. Okay, so we talked a little bit about alternative corridors. And that's why we don't have like an exact length for the preferred corridor because we've got decisions to make, right, Jen?
Right. And I have a
So,
question for when we get a little down the list.
okay, sure, yeah. So as you can see, probably on the map on the screen, we have, if you look above B1, we have C1, C2, C3. So those are three different alternatives for road segments in that area, and the idea is to select one of them and then work our way up. And then once we're done making all those decisions, we have a preferred corridor. So that's sort of how things work. And Jen, you had a question. Was your question? Do you want to
I
ask your
do
question now?
because, oh, sure. We do say that the road is going to be 117 to 164 kilometers in length. So a lot of these alternate corridor pieces look very similar for in length, right? They're almost parallel to each other when we're looking at
Mm-hmm.
F1, F2, for instance. But then we look
Yep.
at the segment of A1 versus A2, and those are significant difference in length because that all depends on the chosen corridor for MF car. So I'm just
Yep.
wondering about how long that segment A1 is.
That's a good question. I do not have that information offhand. I don't know. That's a
Let's
very
dig it
good question
out.
though, because
Yeah.
yeah, we should dig it out. Yeah, we will dig that out. Yeah, I think that'd be interesting actually to dig out. Let's dig that out. We can share that in our next
Hmm.
live stream. We can do that. I'm sure that info is all very much available. So, but yeah, so we go each one of these alternatives gets evaluated in depth, right? So there's a lot of
Hmm.
detailed work that's done. There's field work done on, along both routes. And then there's a lot of complicated, we actually use software that looks at different layers of information and allows you to weigh or make more important some factors than others
Hmm.
in when you're evaluating and trying to choose between and compare um, different alternatives. So it's a pretty the process is really thorough and it takes into consideration a lot of different factors. So that's the one thing
Everything.
about this. It's not a simple straightforward exercise. There's a lot of stuff that's taken into consideration, which is a good thing, right? That's what you want. You want to make sure and you want it to be transparent so that people can see what was done and how those decisions were made. So that's what the process that we use, that's why we do it because it's something that we can make available to people. It's a fairly transparent process. So let's get into the topic of the day, which is climate adaptation and resiliency, the study plan. So let's start with the future climate characterization. So we need to understand what the baseline climate conditions are, the way things are now. Just like we establish baselines for other valued components, we will and are doing that for this study plan. So we're looking at okay the way things are. We also look at what something. So we look at baseline climate conditions through a desktop analysis. We look at regional weather stations from Environment and Climate Change Canada. We also look at stuff like Canadian gridded temperature and precipitation anomalies data from NRCan, from Natural Resources Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada. And so what we're trying to do is paint a picture of what has been normal, whatever normal is now, and then
Hmm.
when things that are not normal happen, what are those things that are not normal that happen? What are they like? Like how big a change in temperature, how big a change in precipitation has occurred? Again, trying to understand how things have been changing in over time, and that helps us predict the future when it comes to this as well too. So it helps us understand historical and present climate trends for the general area, like including the project footprint. And it provides these on a very like regional basis as well too. So the kinds of information that we get are annual and seasonal average and extreme, like minimum and maximum temperatures, annual and seasonal precipitation, and extreme precipitation events like big rainfalls, right, or big snowfalls, wind conditions, right? Like, what are some of the extreme wind days? How do they compare with the past? Are they increasing the number of these extreme wind days, and how windy these events are? Has that been changing over time? We're trying to look at all these patterns and get an idea of what the future might be like. And then things like evaporation, right? How um, looking at estimates of evaporation based on things like temperature and wind speed and relative humidity, barometric pressure, all these other factors. So that's what we're trying to do, is understand what's going on, how things have been trending. Because again, you're trying to sort of think about the future. You want to build something that lasts, right? And you need to
Right.
have an idea of what the future might be like. So uh, when
And
we
people
look
are
at
are
past,
curious about that, right, Don?
very much, Jen, you and I know that through conversations with community members, right? They're the best source of information when it comes to climate change, as far as I'm concerned, because they're in their everyday life, right? They're some of the things, some of these metrics, right? Some of these ways of measuring climate change, they're directly measuring them all the time, right? When it's
Hmm.
especially things like ice thickness, for the winter road, and you and I have heard stories in Webequie about um, how the ice is not nearly as thick as it used to be, or for as long. So there's a lot of information that's collected sort of from the from community members. We can review literature and look at events, but there's only a limited number of weather stations, right? And they're not like a lot of them all over northern Ontario. They're quite large distances in some cases between them, right? So, we rely a lot on interviews with community members to understand things that may have happened, whether it's flooding or major erosion events, or uh, you know uh, permafrost areas that have melted and collapsed, things like that, right? We need to know about that stuff. And in our work, we also rely on data from other studies, like the hydrological studies. When I talk about hydrology or hydrological, I'm talking about surface water, and looking at like surface water flow, and uh, over the land. How the water moves over the land, and looking at flooding events. Um, we also look at vegetation. We look at geology, because geology helps identify, if there's flooding events, will that cause major erosion problems, failures, like landslides, things like that. So it's really important to look at that as well too. So this work is not isolated. It depends a lot on other field studies that are being undertaken. And then we look at future climate scenarios, right, and projections. So we're trying to sort of look at trying to project what might happen in the future, uh, and describe what impact climate change might have on the local and regional climate. And so we look at shifts in key, what you call meteorological variables, things like temperature and precipitation, things like that. And then we look at, changes in these extreme events. Are these extreme events happening more often, and or are they getting more and more extreme, right? Are they getting worse than ever before, and are they happening more often, or is it one or the other, is it both? Trying to understand that, looking at the how rainfall and like increases in rainfall affects runoff and stream flow, and our stream flows higher. Does this cause erosion? And then erosion can also, like extreme erosion, can cause downstream impacts by, of course, the soil particles getting in the water, which can impact the quality of fish habitat. So there's lots of impacts, potential impacts, when you look at future climate scenarios. And then we've got something called the climate change resiliency assessment approach, where we look at three things. The first thing is we do a vulnerability assessment. So what does that mean? Well, when we're talking about vulnerability, it's like sensitivity. Um, how sensitive is the project? What's the potential for the project components? So different project components could be, gravel pits or access roads or bridges or culverts. Those are different project components. How could those be impacted by the climate hazard? So we look at things, like physical resiliency. So resiliency is ability to withstand something, like to sort of withstand like high impacts of extreme weather events. We look at health and safety. Is it a threat to health and safety of people? Um, Ecosystems, so the environment. What changes could some of these extreme events? How vulnerable is the project area to these kind of events, and that vulnerability, how's it expressed? Is it only in ecosystems? Is it in built environment? Is it health and safety? Is it in physical ability to withstand these changes? And then when we identify the vulnerable project components, so the different parts of the project that might be vulnerable, we do what's called a risk assessment. So we look at, like, how likely is it for a project component to fail, for example, for example, a road to blow out, um, and if it did, how bad would it be? We look at all that kind of stuff. So that's the risk analysis. And then if any of those risks are what you call unacceptable, so those risks are too extreme, um, we look at all the risks and we grade them, right? So we call them low, medium, high impact potential, um, and then we do an evaluation of these different risks to get a better understanding of impacts. And then when we've identified potential risks, we look at what's possible to mitigate or control uh, impacts, possible negative impacts. So mitigate means reducing or eliminating impacts. So we look at, okay, what can we do to prevent these things from happening to the different project components. So it could be like passive stuff, like, Jen, just changing the design of the road, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe by just doing that, maybe making the road higher or protecting the road from erosion by lining it with stone on either side. You know what I mean? There's a lot of different ways. So those are passive measures. So you do it in the design phase, but there would also be active measures. So where you're doing more inspection, you have a team out there looking and making sure that everything's behaving the way it's supposed to behave, and that extreme events aren't causing like undue damage. So that's another way. That is a way that we can mitigate, control some of the risk.
And
Then we have.
I'm sure as we get
Go
some
ahead,
of
Jen.
these findings done, people will be pretty happy to know some of these things because Well, you were there at the three road projects forum and elders gathering July 11 to 13 in Thunder Bay. And there were some people who were very curious to understand the effects climate change would have on potential roads, some of the mitigation measures that could be in place, and also the effect of the possibility of melting permafrost on these roads, or
Yeah,
just freeze
yeah,
thaw, right? So
yeah.
there was some questions there, and I'm happy to say we can answer those when we see results.
You know, you're right. You're right, Jen. And some of this work is done in advance, right? Like in the design phase, we look into the
Hmm.
crystal ball and we have a pretty good idea of like when it comes to, some of it we have to do, right? Because like when we're sizing, trying to figure out what size of culvert to use, you've got to anticipate what the flows will be like in a particular
Hmm.
water course in the future, right? So, and then what they do is the engineers will add a factor of safety, right? So they'll think about, okay, what potentially could happen, and then they added safety factors because you don't want to go back and replace that culvert in 5 years after the road's built, right? So the
That's
idea
right.
is to gather that information, identify what you think might be the worst kind of events that you might face, and then design based on that. So the other thing that we consider too is as we always do is the cumulative effects assessment. So we look at the different ways of identifying interactions between the leftover effects of the project, and then we take that and add it or combine it with the effects of other projects, past, present, or reasonably foreseeable. And the idea being that the project doesn't just sit in a vacuum by itself. It's
Hmm.
actually surrounded by other projects, whether they're mining projects or whatever, right? Other roads, etc. And so we look at the big picture. That gives us an idea of to look at the potential leftover effects and combine them together. And then we say, is there any way we can mitigate those, like eliminate or reduce those impacts, those cumulative effects? So that's what we mean by cumulative. Um, and then we look at potential for interaction between valued components from one project and valued components from another project. So it's looking at that big picture. It's remembering that the project doesn't sit on its own. It has to be evaluated. It has to be looked at in the context along with everything, all other projects from the past, present,
Hmm.
and future as well too. So, and then finally, and this is probably the most important one to remember, is that there's follow-up and monitoring programs as well as commitments made during the environmental assessment or impact assessment process. So the follow-up and monitoring programs are proposed to check and make sure that the effects assessment, what we predicted in the effects assessment was accurate, and how effective, and it also checks on how effective the mitigation measures were, right? The measures that we proposed and are undertaking to limit or eliminate impacts. And then if that's determined, the follow-up programs dependent on the results of the assessment, and then speaking with indigenous community members, federal and provincial regulators, and just other interested people and organizations as well. And also, I should note that the environmental assessment report and the impact statement will also contain a big comprehensive list of commitments that are made by the proponents during the course of the EA, and how they'll be addressed. So the thing to remember is that even if the project environmental assessment or impact assessment is approved, that doesn't mean everything just sort of happens
Goes.
from there. There's enforcement, there's monitoring that goes on after that for whatever period of time, depending on whatever we're talking about. So anyway, lots of follow up after the an environmental assessment or impact assessment is finished or approved. So Jen, we have run out of time, and that wraps up today's discussion of the climate Adaptation and Resilience Study Plan. We hope this was helpful and encourages you to join us next week when we discuss the Wildlife and Wildlife Habitat Study Plan. Don't forget to keep
Nice.
in touch with our project team members via the contact information available on our website, northernroadlink.ca. Miigwech, and make sure to look out for project updates on social media and our website.
All right. Team Miigwech.